Why do you think it's important to continue sharing stories such as the internment camps to the younger generations?
Okay, so I don't know what word you're going to use, but we're not using internment camps to describe the 10 prison camps that we were held in. See, euphemistic language really distorted what happened to us. So we're trying to really correct that language. Just like you guys want me to say what my pronouns are, right? Yeah. I still stumble on that.
My parents worked for a very rich French lady. My father was the cook and he was the chauffeur. And my mother was the maid and the housekeeper, and we were living there. You know, we were never rich, but I never felt poor. Anytime I needed something or wanted something, they always provided it. I remember one time I got a bicycle, and he must have thought I was disappointed because it was a boy's bike, and I didn't want a boy's bike. So the next day, or right after that, he welded the thing down, cut it and welded it down and made it a girl's bike and painted it, and it was really pretty. I was so happy. You know, I mean, things like that. You know, it's not like we're really rich and, you know, but they provided everything we ever needed. I never even thought we were poor. And then the war happened.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Japs evacuate vital West Coast areas for the national security. At Los Angeles, 36,000 Japs see the handwriting on the wall and sell out their goods before their voluntary departure. Empty streets and vacated stores stand in shadow. And in the country, the same story. Abandoned farms.
Okay, you can go and get started.
My name is Chizu Omori. I'm 90 years old. So when we got sent into camp, I had just turned 12, so I spent the years between 12 and 15 in a camp. We went directly to Poston, Arizona, which is on the border between Arizona and California. Didn't go to any other camp, but just were there for 3.5 years.
We got to Tule Lake in September of 1943. Tule Lake had been designated as the segregation center for so-called disloyal Japanese. My father was active in Tule Lake politically, and because of that, he was arrested and put into the stockade in December of 1943. Now, the stockade was a prison within a prison. It became a high security concentration camp. People were incarcerated without charges, without trial, and without knowing how long you were going to be incarcerated. All of that precipitated from the riot at Tule Lake. There was a farm truck accident in 1943. A truck that was loaded with farm workers turned over. Many men were injured and one died. The farm workers wanted to have a large funeral for him, but the director of the camp said no, but they held it anyway. Spurred on by that, the farm workers went on strike. They stopped working, and it was right at the peak time of the harvest. And then when they tried to break that up, there was some turmoil, and the director of the camp ended up calling in the army. There were 18 people arrested for causing a disturbance in the camp, and they were put into stockade that was created.
They tried to make it seem as quote unquote normal as possible, which is to say they set up schools and there was athletics and, you know, the churches were set up and all that. I don't know if you've seen pictures of the camps, but there are just these barracks. Like one room in a barrack might be turned into a classroom or say a recreation room where people could have meetings and things like that. So they made do with what they had.
Then 1943, the government was looking to justify the incarceration of 120,000 people based on race. And because there was growing pressure by the American Civil Liberties Union and others inquiring about the constitutionality of the incarceration, the military and the civic group that was running the 10 prison camps put together a questionnaire, the infamous loyalty questionnaire, asking if you would be willing to bear arms against the enemy. And the second had to do with if you would disavow loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. It was a double-bind question because most of the Japanese Americans had never had a loyalty to the emperor. And they felt that if they said no, it would mean that you had loyalty to the emperor. The other was if you would bear arms against the enemy, that meant that it's possible that you would be fighting family members who lived in Japan. This was kind of a no-win situation. Most people answered yes, yes to the loyalty questionnaire. And then many of the young men, 18 and older, were eventually drafted to go fight. My parents answered no, no to both questions. So as a result of that, they were labeled as disloyal. So the so-called disloyals would then be taken from the 10 WRA camps and put in the Tule Lake Segregation Center, which was the maximum security prison for the disloyals. That's where I was born. I also asked my mother why she would have another baby in camp. And she said that they never could get any information about what was going to happen to them, how long they would be detained. But there were rumors all the time. And one of the rumors was if you had more children, you were less likely to have your family separated. And I was born out of desperation. By then, my parents were very disheartened about their future, what could happen, what kind of life would there be for their children.
They literally came out of the camps with nothing. And all that was given to them was $25 and a ticket to go to wherever they wanted to go. That's all they came out with.
My mother, she always told us to be quiet. Lower the TV. You know, you're talking too loud. You're going to bother people. Things like that. I know that came from camp. That's part of her trauma.
My mother talked some about it. My father never spoke a word about it at all. And, you know, as a psychotherapist, I understand that unjust incarceration is a form of mass trauma. And one of the consequences of trauma is that people compartmentalize and don't want to relive the pain and suffering, the humiliation. You know, it's a loss of dignity. And Japanese culture is a collective culture. So belonging is a primary value. So when you're cast out of your community, it's shameful, whether you deserved it or not. And I think the other reason that people didn't talk about it, including my parents, was they didn't really want to burden their children with their pain and suffering and losses. They were desperate to make a life for themselves afterwards. So they just dug down deep, went to work, and did what they could to put clothes on our backs and feed us.
You know, when they say, what's your parents do? And I wrote domestic, and thinking, you know, it's not anything you could be really proud of that the parents are domestics. But I found out later on that those are the only jobs they could get, domestic or gardeners. That's, if I think about it now, everybody I knew was either, the older people were either gardeners or domestics, or they were maintenance people. They were lucky that they were maintenance people.
It disconnected us somewhat from our parents because we sensed that there was something. I mean, we all knew we were in camp, but we didn't really know what that meant.
My parents were wonderful. They were the nicest people. They never complained about anything. They never, they were always wanting to help. I never tried to bother them, but, if I ever needed help, I knew that they would help me. So, like I said, they never talked about camp, and so I never knew. That's one of my guilts. I feel really guilty because by the time I found out how horrible it really was, it was too late. They were gone. Their life as young people, that enjoying life, I think ended in camp because everything was for the kids after that. Nothing really for themselves. It's so sad. I have a lot of guilt about that too. I carry a lot of guilt from not knowing anything about camp, not asking them, not knowing their story. I don't even know where my father came from, to tell you the truth. I know he went back to Japan at one point, and because his mother was dying, but I don't even know where that was.
People say it's remarkable that Japanese Americans came to the internment without being, having like a real chip on our shoulders. There's a chip there. When you really get down and talk to them, there's anger, there's hurt, but the overcoming of that, just to make things livable, is a gift that that folks give. It's really generous, and it's hard to understand it too much later on. I couldn't see it in my parents. I saw it as weakness. It's not.
Our community was really hurt by having been rounded up and put into camps. And it took us a long time to process what had happened to us and to realize that this was really wrong and the country needed to acknowledge the wrong that was done to our group. So my husband and I were into politics, and so we're very involved in the civil rights movement during the 60s. And also Japanese Americans began to, I guess part of it, they were influenced by the Black civil rights movement. They began to think about what had happened to us and how we need to demand an apology and redress from the government. So I got very involved in the redress movement, as it was called. And that was a 10-year fight to get a bill passed through Congress.
By the time I do government service, I already had local government service. And I'll tell you, for me personally, like when I took that job, it's unlike any other job or anything you do. Like I work like crazy. I've never worked so hard in my life. My mom lived in Little Tokyo in LA, but my feeling was like, if I mess up on this redress work, my mom can't walk in J-Town. It's shame. One for the issue, but like another part behind me was saying, I couldn't let my mom be shamed.
There was one movement towards judicial redress. It was a legal fight, and I was a named plaintiff in a class action suit, which is called William Horry versus the United States. And we got our case heard at the Supreme Court. So I was lucky enough to go to Washington and watch our case being heard in front of the Supreme Court. Our case did not win in the sense that Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill of 1988, but it was very influential in the sense that it was being heard in front of the Supreme Court. So it probably influenced passage of the Civil Rights Bill in Congress on account of we were asking for a whole lot more redress money.
More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For here we admit a wrong. The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years.
Do you believe that the compensation you received gave you closure?
No, not really. I think that it's going to be some time before that happens. I think part of it is, for us, is continue to tell and relate our stories. And it just sort of made me not chuckle, but it just seemed like how ironic that the people who really should be telling the story is my parents and my sisters, but we've lost them all. And so now we're stuck with people who were 4, who were just born in camp and 4 years old, telling this story. And it seems like, oh my gosh, I've suddenly become an elder, not only because of my age, but just the fact that, you know, the time has passed. Yeah, it just feels like, what did you say? Not a privilege so much as that it's incumbent of us to be able to share that information, because one of the things they keep telling us is that we are primary sources. And although I don't remember everything, I've learned a lot from listening to other people, because, you know, in all the times that we've been involved in educating people, I've heard people who were teenagers, who were parents, talking, and so I'm able to incorporate that into my presentation.
When I think about the injustice of the Japanese Americans being incarcerated, and we've talked for a while about the parallels with the innocent asylum seekers being criminalized and being held for indefinite detention, family separation, and being treated like criminals in prisons. And I've gone to visit some of these mothers and children in Texas while they were incarcerated, and I see myself in the children there, terrified, filled with trauma. But it's not just a parallel experience, it's a pattern.
Our incarceration really fits into a pattern of racism which has been part of our American history from the very beginning.
The genocide of the indigenous people, the bringing slaves from Africa, enslaving them for decades. During the Depression, Mexican-American citizens were deported out of the country to create more labor for white people. Chinese Exclusion Act, it was a race-based exclusion of immigrants from a country. Japanese incarceration, and today, people escaping violence in their own country, seeking legal asylum in this country, are treated as criminals. Racism and white supremacy has been part of the American way of life from the beginning.
It's real easy to become outraged at the most obvious things, like having a knee on someone's neck for 9 minutes. That's easy outrage, and you should be outraged at it. But to really carry it forward, it's like understand it, but also understanding it from the viewpoint of that jerk that had his knee on the guy's neck. Because you need to understand it in order to fix it.
I'm hopeful, but I'm not certain. It's become a lot bigger than anything that I've seen up to now.
Even though the focus at the moment is like police brutality and the kind of militarized police forces that we have now, that's the focus, but we all realize, yeah, well, it's much bigger than that now.
Yeah, you have to. I don't think you have a choice. Like the stuff we're going through now is nothing unlike we've gone through before. We're only at the beginning of this. This is going to be huge. I mean, I don't have a sense that I can wrap my head around what this is going to be like.
I think the intergenerational bond in making change is really important. Us elders have the historical context, and I have found that working together with the young people and this kind of mutual exchange of knowledge and information has been really profound. Protest is powerful and profound, and to keep broadening the coalitions and the alliances is really important, to work cross-community. But protest itself isn't enough. We need deep policy change. We need legislation that reflects a true democracy. Stories are memory, and remembering is actually a form of protest. The perpetrator who commits a crime against a community of people would like everybody to forget that that happened. And so when we keep our stories alive, we remember, and we pass that memory on to the next generation as the guiding light for change. If we don't keep these stories alive, people could go off track, lose the meaning. So that the story of the Japanese Americans and being able to link that to the story of what's happening to the mothers and children being separated in the detention facilities today. It's our story that helped to uplift the protest of what's happening today. So these stories are essential narrative for framing what's happening in the present from stories from the past.